Hey, good afternoon. My name is Lance French, and I'm the marketing manager with W&M Environmental. And I'd like to welcome you to our Defining U.S. Waters webinar. And our guest speaker today is Aaron Brewer. Good morning, Aaron.
Hello.
Just a few quick housekeeping issues. We will have some time for a few questions throughout the webinar, but if you want to send us your questions through the chat button, I think you have a little window where it says chat, and I will get to your questions when we have a pause in the webinar. If we don't get to your question right away, I will make sure that Aaron sees your question and that responds as quickly as he can. One last note, we are going to record this webinar and it will be posted on our website this afternoon, and I will be sending you the link after the webinar and once it's posted. Aaron, thank you for joining us today. I know you have a lot to share with us, so without further delay, take it away.
Yes, sir. Let's jump on in. It'd be nice if my screen responded. Splash.
Technical delays, yes.
There we go. You can see it. My first subject of the day. You see a pond on the screen there?
Yep, this is water. Yep, looks great.
Okay, thanks. Okay, yes. The topic of the day, waters of the U.S. A focus on the Clean Water Act, the use of the definition, and permitting. Test subject A here is this a water of the U.S.? Do I need a permit to fill it? And it's just some tank in North Texas. Why is the federal government involved? As the name implies, a water has to have some significant tie to national interest to be a water of the U.S. Defining the line between the greater waters of our country and the marginal waters that extend into every corner of every state, that is the challenge of defining waters of the U.S. and the fight currently reignited in the court and halls of Congress. Here's a graphical depiction of the water cycle. Rain, snow become groundwater and streams, fill in the rivers and lakes, so on. Somewhere along that route is the water sitting in the wetland on your project site. Water on your property came from somewhere else, and it will end up somewhere else. What someone else does to it before it gets to your property affects your use of the water, and what you do to it before it leaves your property affects someone else's use of that water. We are here to examine that connection in our effort to understand the reach of the Clean Water Act and define waters of the U.S. to help make us decisions about real estate and permits. Waters of the U.S. are surface waters. Groundwater lies below them and feeds into them. But when we reference a water of the U.S., we are generally talking about what is at the surface. Here's a view of Waco and areas west of town. You've probably seen the Brazos River from I-35. It's pretty easy to see how that may be a water of the U.S. The hard part is the classification of tributaries and ponds and wetlands near them. Those tiny streams and ponds each may have some seemingly insignificant impact on the Brazos River, but how would you measure that? The definition of waters of the U.S. has gone through an evolution of changes and revisions. Right now, the new definition is held up in court, but is poised to change overnight if that gets resolved. Today, we are defining waters of the U.S. to the best of our ability with the tools we have now, the old rules and guidance, and we are certain, however, that the definitions will evolve. But don't freak out, we can figure it out. The Clean Water Act was passed in 1972 to improve water quality in the United States. Defining waters of the U.S. defines the reach of those regulations. The Clean Water Act was intended to regulate discharges like the mysterious substance flowing from the pipe in the upper left. Rivers in America used to be very polluted. My beloved Mississippi, thick with untreated sewage, a river catches fire. Congress acted to protect surface water as a shared resource. Since the inception of the Clean Water Act, special interests have battled the feds in court to affect how the rules are applied and to what extent. Early on, the coverage was extended to include adjacent wetlands. The most recent change was the Clean Water Rule, which went into effect in 2015. Its stated intent was to clarify what is and is not a water of the U.S. Some actions in federal court in October 2015 put that rule on hold. That's where it stays right now. So yes, we all need clean water to drink. Our factories shouldn't dump untreated sewage into the same rivers we all drink from. That seems obvious. But is your drinking water supply really threatened by a landowner filling a small recreational pond with clean dirt? Probably not in any significant way, but as it turns out, significance is a really hard thing to test. The idea of testing the significance of a water is built into the existing guidance and was codified with the Clean Water Rule. The function or destruction of this water could have a significant impact on a navigable water for the Clean Water Act to have jurisdiction. The current rules for defining water of the U.S. are based on federal code dating back to 1986. They include waters used in interstate or foreign commerce, think barges, subject to ebb and flow of the tide, the Houston Channel again. Interstate waters, including wetlands. The big ones would be the Red River and Sabine, but smaller wetlands happen to be situated across borders. Impoundments of any of those, so any dam built on those, that'd be included. And then just broadly tributaries, not really defined, but all the little rivers and streams. And it can extend into some ditches. We'll cover that. Territorial seas, a fancy word for the shoreline out up to about 12 miles. And then, wetlands, all to adjacent to all of those. So that just kind of blows it up right there. And there are some important exclusions. If you've been farming a wetland, it's still excluded as a water of the U.S. Or if you built a waste treatment system, that's excluded. I want to show you some examples of waters of the U.S. and Texas to put a picture to these terms. Traditional navigable water is not a term in the definition, but they all meet the definitions of waters of the U.S. Traditional navigable water are susceptible for use in interstate or foreign commerce, including all waters subject to ebb and flow of the tide. The water pictured here is part of the Houston Ship Channel. It's both subject to interstate and foreign commerce and subject to ebb and flow of the tide. Here are some of the traditional navigable waters in Texas. There's a list of them that the Corps put out for, this is not all of them, but it's something you can count on there. As a brief side note here, the Corps of Engineers is broken down to 4 districts covered across the state, and they're the agency that regulates the Clean Water Act here in Texas. So if you have a project in a county, that respective county is assigned to a certain Corps district. Agencies are given latitude to interpret the rules, but I've also noticed some differences in the way the districts apply the rules. So if you work in a new district, make sure you make contacts with local offices and learn their ways. Moving down the list of what is defined as a water of the U.S., they include interstate waters, the Sabine, Red River, Rio Grande. But I suppose some small wetland in Panola County, like the one pictured here, or some portion extends into Louisiana, that would be a water of the U.S. Impoundments, on down. So Lake Roberts separates Elm Fork of the Trinity River from itself, jurisdictional water of the U.S. Or a small tank in someone's backyard or field. If it impounds a water that is otherwise a water of the U.S., then the impoundment is part of a water of the U.S. 3 are highlighted here. Ponds or impoundments on jurisdictional tributaries are waters of the U.S. Then the blue arrows point out ponds that could be impoundments, but if you can't tell from just a topo map if they're jurisdictional, perhaps they're not. Two things worth mentioning here. One, making a jurisdictional determination and finding a pond, a water of the U.S., are basically the same thing for our purposes here. If you find that a pond is a water of the U.S. subject to Section 404 of the Clean Water Act, you've made a jurisdictional determination. And two, the Corps is tasked with making jurisdictional determinations, and they haven't delegated that to us. We just do our best to arrive at the same conclusion we think they would. This is a close-up of one of those tributary impoundments on that previous topographic map. These two neighbors might think that they have the same type of pond, but one is probably jurisdictional, there with the red arrow, because it is within a stream, and the other is probably not a jurisdictional water. It's off the channel. An example of another non-jurisdictional impoundment. It's located along a swale, so there's no ordinary high water mark upstream to the north. To the south, past the impoundment, there's a wetland there, but there's not another ordinary high water mark till south of that road. So here you have a non-jurisdictional tank. Thank goodness there's a few around. Tributaries. The 1986 definition of waters of the U.S. simply states that tributaries to navigable waters and interstate waters are waters of the U.S. The most recent guidance from the Corps of Engineers and EPA is the post-Rapinos guidance from 2008. The guidance is named for an important court case of that era, and it is limited in scope to providing guidance for traditional navigable waters, tributaries, and adjacent wetlands, and only for Section 404 of the Clean Water Act. The guidance said that traditional navigable waters are waters of the U.S. What about non-navigable tributaries? They conclude that they are included if they are relatively permanent waters. We'll call those intermittent streams. For all other tributaries, they devised a significant nexus test. Tributaries had to have a significant influence on the biological, chemical, or physical condition of the traditional navigable water. In theory, that included tributaries with insubstantial or speculative influence on traditional navigable waters. The guidance suggested that we use ordinary high water mark and bed and bank of a tributary as evidence of flow characteristics. There are some other factors, excuse me, blame it on the cedar. But there's some other factors to consider, but the districts are relying heavy on the existence of our ordinary high water mark to determine jurisdiction. Your alternative would be to attempt a scientific study of each little tributary, and there usually isn't time, money, data to do such an endeavor. And so no defined benchmark about what influences are significant. So you can't hit a goal if you don't have a target. The Clean Water Rule that took effect in August 2015 and is now on hold in the courts put the ordinary high water mark and bed and bank requirements into the rule. They have interpreted it as a mass extension of, some people have interpreted as a mass extension of jurisdiction. I see it more as a canonization of existing methods. Here's a tributary. It is a perennial stream, flows year-round, and it flows directly into a traditional navigable water. It has a bed and bank. The ordinary high water marks are hard to see, but they are marked by a line on the bank. Not the highest the river has flowed. As you can all guess, the floods this fall went way beyond that. The ordinary high water mark is quasi-scientific, but it kind of shows where a typical rainfall may bounce the flow up to a certain point that has a big influence on how the stream looks. The force of the water frequently hitting that mark has removed or bent vegetation, distorted sediment, and scours along the lower bank. This picture depicts an intermittent stream in the piney woods. You can see some shelving on the left bank. There was a moss trim line, and so water flowing within the ordinary high water mark removes much of the duff sitting on the bed. Here you can see a little debris has fallen again on the left bank. So you have to look at a lot of different features to put them together to put a picture of what the ordinary high water mark is. Of course, it goes on up the stream, on up to the top of these watersheds into ephemeral tributaries. Another example here of ephemeral stream with the bed and bank in ordinary high water mark, the jurisdictional water of the U.S. Here's a potentially hot category, extreme tributaries. In this case, the exposed ground has experienced some water rushing over it to remove the fallen leaves and finer sediment. But unless you get out your electron microscope, you're not going to see much of a bank. I toured the site with the Corps of Engineers personnel, and it was their opinion that this was a water of the U.S. North Texas and the project sponsors in this area might see some relief from the high cost of stream mitigation if areas like this are excluded as waters of the U.S. under the Clean Water Rule because they don't have a clear bank, but that remains to be seen. Banks technically can be gradual, but really, how gradual? In some ways, this tributary looks more like a stream than the last example. You can see a bank. The bed is fairly obscure. It does not have a great ordinary high water mark to begin with, but any sign of them disappears at the toe of this steep slope. It pans out into a grassy field in the upper terrace of an intermittent stream where the surface water soaks into the ground, so it's not a water of the U.S. You're starting to see as we move up the system, it gets harder to tell what is and is not a water of the U.S. You've seen some examples of small streams, some of which are not jurisdictional tributaries. The last group of waters that are jurisdictional by old rule and new are wetlands deemed adjacent to each of the waters described above. An important side note here, the old term is adjacent wetlands, and the Clean Water Rule reads adjacent waters. Big difference. There's wetlands as one certain class, waters the bigger class. So yes, where are the wetlands in Texas? Wetlands generally form in areas of disturbance and where precipitation exceeds evaporation and transpiration. Fact is that good drainage and excessive evaporation, heat, make fewer wetlands. Big Bend is well drained, low on precipitation, high on heat, but it does have some wetlands. Maybe not evident in this picture, but in this setting, wetlands form in predictable areas along rivers and in odd places like seeps growing on a hill. Where wetlands are adjacent to the traditional navigable water or their tributaries, they are jurisdictional waters of the U.S. This graphic of typical Texas wetlands shows a particularly interesting trend. This doesn't include all the tanks built around the state, but put that aside for now. Most of the wetlands in Texas are associated with rivers and streams, i.e. jurisdictional waters of the U.S. The possible exceptions are the playa lakes, which are depressions, mostly up in the panhandle, and wetlands that form in depressions, they don't usually have outlets. So also we'll see down on the Gulf Coast, marshes and prairie depressions. There again, got water that gets trapped into a depression and mostly sits there. Traditionally, they've not been included with waters of the U.S. The Clean Water Rule could change that for depressions in the Texas Gulf Coast. Some important exclusions to what is water of the U.S. There's now, there'll continue to be wet areas that are excluded from the definition. These can be difficult, but there's logic to it. So the Corps regulates waters of the U.S. when they are truly part of a greater surface water system. This ditch has some wetland look to it, but it terminates before connecting to any other water, so it's non-jurisdictional. Bring in the bulldozers. This ditch here was excavated in upland, and it drains only uplands. So a lot of these, between fields, and so not water of the U.S. So now we get to the recent Clean Water Rule and some of the controversy around it, I guess. Have a million comments. That's quite a lot. I've heard that whenever they bring these types of rules up that affect waters of the U.S. and wetlands, get a huge interest and huge response. It's typical. Read a recent report that said that estimated maybe 3 to 5% more positive assertions of jurisdiction over the current field practices. I really don't think people know how it's going to shake out yet. There's a lot of the little guidance to be issued and decided upon.
Hey, Aaron, I have a quick
Yep.
question. I think it has to do with the last slide that you showed. Peter asks, so a ditch excavated for drainage purpose is not jurisdictional?
If it's excavated in dry land. So this one here, I've looked at the old topographic maps. There was no stream here, no swale. It was a field, and they dug it to drain uplands. So it's a ditch dug within uplands, and it doesn't drain a wetland. It doesn't replace another stream. We have to fit all those for that to be true. So not all ditches are equal, but this ditch, not a water of the U.S. So yeah, there's lawsuits going on. It's been blocked. The Clean Water Act is, the Clean Water Rule is on hold. But there was one piece of that is a little hopeful. His stated intentions was to clarify and be more predictable, and less ambiguous, and more timely. And that would be, all our efforts towards making jurisdictional determinations. I hope that is the result when the dust settles. So breaking it into the two categories, it has a bunch of waters that you can see here are jurisdictional by rule, categorical, waters of the U.S. And they're similar to the, there's no changes to a lot of these. Traditional navigable waters, interstate waters, territorial seas, impoundments. There's some slight change to tributary. It is now defined to have, so ordinary high water mark. Bed and bank is ordinary high water mark, so it has to have another one, and evidence of flowing water. So when I was referring to maybe the way it shakes out, there might be some streams, especially in central Texas, that maybe get excluded because they don't have broad banks or obvious banks, but we'll see. And then they have a new term, neighboring waters. So it used to be just adjacent waters. Now they put some bright lines in there. They include if you have a water within 100 feet of an ordinary high water mark of a jurisdictional water, and that could be pretty broad too. So if you have some little stream coming to your property in a tank within 100 feet, you're going to pull that in now. That's a little nerving. So waters within 100-year floodplain that are within 1,500 feet of an ordinary high water mark of a jurisdictional water, and then any waters within 1,500 feet of a high tide line or Great Lake. And that pulls some more questionable items into jurisdiction here in Texas. The other category is the case-specific ones that still have that significant nexus. We're going to have to apply that to Texas coastal wetlands and to any water within 4,000 feet of a jurisdictional water. Two big problems there is how are you going to know what's a jurisdictional water off your property? I mean, within 4,000 feet radius, that's big. That's a huge undertaking. That not very helpful, but I suppose we can be thankful for what we get. So skipping over the parts of the Clean Water Act that did not change and into tributaries. Tributaries, ditches, and swales extend into nearly every project we work on. So let's look at a few examples of how we evaluate them. The current practices are not that different from the proposed Clean Water Rule. This map contains some mapped tributaries that are probably waters of the U.S., the blue lines. It also has some possible stream signatures that require a closer look. Looking at this aerial photograph, the streams in general are fairly easy to identify with a little experience, but these possible stream signatures only showed up in a few of the many aerial photographs that were reviewed here. Turns out they were just swales without wetlands, so they're not jurisdictional. They didn't have ordinary high water mark or bed and bank. And so the upstream ponds, like the one shown in the upper right here, are also not jurisdictional waters. They probably overflow during rare events, but on balance, they are isolated from traditional navigable waters. There's a photo taken on the ground of one of those swales seen in the previous aerial photograph. And another photo further downstream. So when you're assessing a property for waters of the U.S., you want to look at the drainage system as a whole. There was no indication of wetlands or streams downstream of the swale. So impoundments usually interrupt a tributary, and way up in the system we've got ephemeral streams. It really adds a bit of confusion there, and good questions about when you do and don't have jurisdiction. So the case study here, a pond built on a tiny stream. There are ordinary high water marks and evidence of flow uphill and down. Here's some pictures on the ground here. There was a couple of streams and ditches that flowed into that tank. The previous photo showed it when it's full of water. Here we see it during drought. And because it met all those criteria, these are waters of the U.S., the frontier of waters of the U.S.
Hey, Aaron, I have another question. Yes. Rajesh asked, if a lake is not connected to any other body of water, does that mean that it's not jurisdictional as a water of the U.S.?
No, I don't get deep into that, but you have to look at that lake and what it's used for. So if you have international anglers coming in and fishing, that's foreign commerce, and the Commerce Clause brings in jurisdiction. So you have to be careful. There's, you have to go through the whole list. And I kind of gloss over the commercial part of it because that's actually, to me, that's pretty rare. You're not usually looking at that, but you have to be thorough. So I'm getting back into tributaries here. I want to do a little education about bed and bank because these are required now with the Clean Water Rule if it takes effect, and to me very interesting. Some obvious case of a little intermittent stream here on the left shows the bed and bank. You can tell, you probably recognize that as such. There's another set here to the right, obviously some work in the stream, but can't really make out the bank. And you kind of start to wonder, I've seen a lot of these situations, I've seen them dry too, and you wonder, is that enough? If that bank is missing, are you going to call that a bank? Can you have a bed without a bank? I think that question's yet to be answered by the Corps, and I'm excited to see how it turns out. So yes, adjacent waters are waters of the U.S. in the Clean Water Rule. And we've kind of already been through the breakdown. They tried to give us some bright lines to work with, and that ended up getting them in some trouble. Adjacent water still here. So the tank highlighted here with that arrow, the nearest map tributary is approximately 600 feet to the north. There is no map tributary in the gap that's circled, but the elevation line suggests that one might exist. Under the old rules, the tank would be jurisdictional water of the U.S. if there's ordinary high water marks up and downstream. If it lacked ordinary high water mark upslope, you might consider a significant nexus determination if the tank contains wetlands. Under the clean water rule, the tank would be a categorical water of the U.S. if it's within 100 feet of a tributary. So if there is some kind of tributary coming up that, coming from the north towards that tank, it really makes you wonder what you would do if you had no access to the north and couldn't see 100 feet. So the bright line rules for adjacent waters present some practical assessment problems. That sums up adjacent waters, but there is another hurdle with the clean water rule. That tank is within 4,000 feet of a tributary. The clean water rule requires a significant nexus test. We're grateful to have the 400-foot bright line that is drawing at least a line in sand, but checking for a tributary within 4,000 feet of a pond is just ridiculous. It's not current practice. I propose that tanks about this size with no ordinary high water mark upstream or down are similarly situated in Fort Worth and not waters of the U.S. I hope that's how it ends up panning out. So in the clean water rule, waters within the 100-year floodplain and within 1,500 feet of an ordinary high water mark of a water, they are waters of the U.S. The previously isolated wetlands within floodplain tended to be assumed jurisdictional, so that's not a big change. That was a practice here at least. So that previous floodplain picture, this is a wetland that's within one of those floodplains. It's situated in the piney woods. It is a depression on a terrace well above the active floodplain. If this area hasn't flooded in the last 20 years or so, I would think it deserves a significant nexus evaluation before deemed a water of the U.S. But that's going away. Beyond 1,500 feet and within the 100-year floodplain, you still got to do the case-specific significant nexus. So here's just an example. Forested wetland in floodplain of the Sabine River, more than 1,500 feet, you have to do significant nexus. I've heard that most of those turn into waters of the U.S. anyway, so that might be a moot point. So waters within 1,500 feet from the high tide line. We've got an excavated pond located approximately 800 feet from Nueces Bay, which is within that 1,500 foot of the high tide line. Under the current rules, it looks isolated. There on the right, you can see it. Under the Clean Water Act, or Clean Water Rule, it is a categorical water of the U.S., so pull that in. That would be one of the changes here in Texas if the rules take hold. So we've talked a bit about the significant nexus test, and it gets back to, that's just from reading the Clean Water Act and from the Rapinos court case. So the Clean Water Act says its purpose is to restore and maintain the chemical, physical, and biological integrity of the nation's waters. And some of the functions that are measured during the significant nexus evaluation, there's the chemical, so sediment trapping, nutrient, pollutant transformation. Transformation would be turning a pollutant into a non-pollutant, filtering out sediment, I suppose. Then there's some physical and biological attributes that are measured as well. In evaluating whether a single water has a significant effect on a chemical, physical, or biological function of a traditional navigable water, interstate water, or the sea, the Corps is tasked with determining whether that significant nexus exists by measuring the attributes of that water. The same evaluation can be applied to a group of similarly situated waters. Texas coastal prairie wetlands are one such group. The Clean Water Rule lists 5 types of similarly situated waters that include Texas prairie depressions, but they also effectively grouped tributaries that have ordinary high water mark and bed and banks. The bed and bank and ordinary high water mark indicate sufficient flow to affect the traditional navigable water. So getting back to the coastal prairie wetlands, there's a couple maps. You can see there's always some discrepancy on what they include as the Texas Gulf Coast prairie. So that'll be the first challenge. They're not that big of differences, mostly on the south end, but okay, what area are we talking about? Or maybe are we talking closer to the coast, more of an influence from the coast? Here I've got a photograph taken about 1995 in Houston. You can imagine it doesn't look like that anymore, but it shows a collection of what's probably some coastal prairie wetlands. The area somehow drains to Buffalo Bayou, which is traditional navigable water. These wetlands shown here, a lot of them, they look isolated. They're just blobs. They don't have streams coming out of them. If you look at some of the other resources, you can kind of see that. So in past what might have been an isolated water, we've got to evaluate these as having significant nexus to traditional navigable water. That might turn out making these now jurisdictional waters. Then you got to get a permit. So here, just an example here of some development on Dauphin Island. They obviously had to get some permits to fill this in and build their residential development. Makes it sound so easy. So while the definition of a water U.S. is wrangled between the courts, legislatures, presidents, and agencies, we must make decisions about what aquatic features are regulated waters of the U.S. and secure permits for our clients' projects when necessary. So most of the permits for projects affecting waters of the U.S. require a Section 404 permit. Section 401 water quality certifications are required with every 404 permit, and project in navigable waters require a Section 10 permit. You basically use one application for all of these. The 404 and 401 permits have different thresholds. The basic determination is the area of water of the U.S. that being affected. When impacts to waters of the U.S. are under a half acre, that is the easiest. It takes about 2 to 3 months to get your permit, and there's no separate public notices. When the impacts exceed that number, things get complicated. I got a little bit of a permit starter kit outlined here, just about some of the things that you need in place or to consider if you need a wetland permit. Sometimes simply referred to as a wetland delineation, you need to know the boundaries of wetlands and ponds and the length and average width of your streams. The site plan is sometimes a chicken and the egg riddle. It's vital to get the wetland planning up front so you can get the project timetable and economics right. You don't want to get upset down the road when you discover you've proposed to fill God's favorite wetland. But plans come in stages, so I'm well aware that the point someone should be applying for a permit, the plans aren't usually final at that point. And mitigation, the first instinct for mitigation is, I'm going to fill an acre of wetland. Now, how much is that going to cost me? Well, the rules are written to require upfront planning to avoid impacts to waters of the U.S. as much as possible. First, you're supposed to eliminate those 3 to 10 residential lots over that little stream before you come asking for a permit. That doesn't always happen, and it can be a conflict during the permitting process. After that, you compensate. But credits from a wetland bank that has, in most cases, restored some wetlands by undoing some past alteration, then they sell you some credits. It's a pretty big expenditure. So if those credits are not available, then you have to build your own project to mitigate for the impacts. And you don't want to do that, really, unless you have to. So here's just some examples of the kind of site plans you need when you're planning your permit, proposed and previous or existing proposed contours. You need a upper right-hand corner here. We've got a cross-section that shows where the stream used to sit. It looks like this one here, we're moving it over. And cut and fill maps are usually not always that obvious. These guys are spending a lot of money here, but they show you where you're filling wetlands or cutting them. It helps for the planning process. So mitigation is further broken down into avoidance, minimization, and then compensation. This piece of property in East Texas was recently developed with an auto dealership. They had one of those properties that you sometimes see that has a big piece of stream running through it that you'd like to bury in a box culvert or move to a drainage ditch. It's a big pain when it runs right to the middle of it, and especially out by the frontage there. So for whatever reason, they went a new way and showed some real effort with their avoidance. Maybe it was the price, up to $500 per linear foot of stream that you filled. If that's your price for mitigation, that adds up quick. This is some on-the-ground photos of that site. The stream now divides their parking lot, and they have a bridge joining it. And there's a bridge between their frontage and their main building. This is down at the downslope end of it, just to kind of give you an idea what it might look like. Out beyond the rock, it's probably what it looked like before. There's a little bit of erosion there from the neighbors there tearing out all the woody vegetation. Usually promote some kind of problem out there, but anyhow. This is the money shot. You can see that they successfully and mostly avoided impacts of the stream. They minimized their impacts, at least to get them below the threshold for compensation. It looks like a long-term problem for them. Weeds are going to be coming up. It's going to be, something to maintain. It's kind of an odd feature, but anyhow. I think of problems for the creek too, but so I'm not really satisfied with this result. It's frustrating that the rules push people to do this, but I understand why, and I compliment them for being creative on this. The other bit is you're supposed to minimize your impacts. This is a photo from a public notice, someone else's project in North Texas. The proposed residential lots and streets are fairly obvious, and they lay out, shows a great effort to minimize impacts to the waters of the U.S., which are shown there in pink and green. The orange shows historical impacts to wetlands, and the blue shows proposed impacts to waters of the U.S. If the impacts were less than a half acre of waters of the U.S., they might be eligible for a nationwide permit, 29 for residential developments. We wouldn't be seeing this public notice, and they would have had their permit already, but they were greater than a half acre. They had to apply for an individual permit, and projects like that get estimated in more 6 to 18 month time frame, depending on how much back and forth there is, how long it takes you to respond due to background issues. And I'm sure that they got hit with a crueler form of minimization, which is the alternatives analysis. That requires that they justify why this is the best place to build a residential development as opposed to down the street where there might be no wetlands. For the development here, I could see them having to justify why the project must impact wetlands above the half-acre threshold. So look at any lot with the blue crossing it and justify why it must be built. That extra extra 50,000 a lot is not a sufficient argument for the alternatives analysis. So that is a hard concept for developers to accept, they're being pushed by other forces to maximize use of the land. It's just completely foreign to approach a development like that. It's a fascinating topic, the conflict between modern man's built environment and the resources we depend on, but it's one of the hardest aspects of permitting larger impacts to waters of the U.S. And then here again, impacts to these wetlands would need compensation. If a wetland bank is available, wetland credits in this area average around $20,000 per acre for average wetlands. So I hope you've learned something about the defined waters of the U.S., however the rules changed. It can be simplified by a reasoned approach. There are some big things to look out for. Finding jurisdiction for coastal prairie wetlands and tributaries. Interesting to see how that's going to shake out. The details there could be really big for Texas. And start your planning early. And if you have any questions, please feel free to contact me. That includes the other consultants out there. I'll quote Thomas Jefferson, who said, "He who lights the candle at mine receives light without darkening me." So, thank you.
All right, great job, Aaron. Terrific webinar, and it looks like there's was a lot of great information in there. So I just wanted to remind you guys that we did record this session, and I will be emailing the slides as well as the link for the recording. So if you want to go back to it later, and because there was some great information, and you can also email me with any questions. I'll make sure Aaron gets them. You guys have a great afternoon, and we'll be seeing you next time. Thanks, Aaron.
Thank you very much.